simplifying square roots using I. So I is a number that represents the square root of -1. We've talked about how you cannot take the square root of a negative number. If you do, you get something that's not real. And so that's where I comes in. I represents imaginary numbers. When we are simplifying a square root that has I involved in it, we want to make sure we remember the rule that the square root of A times B is the same thing as the square root of A times the square root of B. With that being said, we have two problems here we are asked to simplify. And so this first one, it's the square root of -360. So again, we're taking the square root of a negative. We know we're not allowed to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this apart into the square root of -1 times the square root of 360. I know that -1 times 360 gives us this -360 that we have up here. So breaking these apart now, I know what we saw on the last slide, that the square root of -1 is just I. So I can change this so that it becomes I times the square root of 360. But back at some of our other videos with simplifying square roots, Brooke and Sophia reminded us that we are not allowed to have a square root of a radicand that has a perfect square factor in it. So we need to break this 360 apart, and I know that 360 is divisible by the number 36. And so 36 times 10 gives me 360, so I can break this apart even more. I want to do that, and that makes this square root 36 become 6. My square root 10 cannot be simplified any further, so we leave that square root 10. So I have I times 6 square root 10. To write it in the most simplified form, we want to have our coefficient out front, and then I comes second, and that's getting multiplied by square root 10. One more where we're going to simplify, very similar process inside our radical symbol. We have the radicand of -48. We cannot take the square root of a negative, so we break that apart into square root -1 times square root 48. We want to do that because we know that the square root of -1 is I, as Brooke and Sophia told us. And then again with our square root 48, we want to break that apart into perfect square factors. I know that 48 is divisible by 16, which is a perfect square, so I can rewrite this as 3i. So my 3 comes down, this turned into I, and this got broken apart into 16 times 3. I want to do that because I know that the square root of 16 is going to give me 4. And then putting everything together, multiplying all my things that are outside my radical symbol, 3 times 4 times I is going to give me 12i. And then my square root 3 stays inside the square root.